All right. So when and where is the event?
It's on Friday at 10:30 at the Chalke History Festival, which is near Salisbury in Wiltshire.
Yeah, and could you tell us a little bit about what you're speaking about?
So I'm talking about what's known as the death match, which is um, a game played in Kiev during the Second World War. And I mean, it's very complicated, the story, but to cut a long story short, there was a load of Dynamo Kiev players who would gather together at a bakery during the war, that they were living and working in the bakery. And when football restarted after the German occupation of Ukraine, uh, they would play regular games. It wasn't a league. There was this, series of regular sort of friendlies between garrison sides and local teams. And this team of former Dynamo Kiev players, they became known as Start, and they played a load of garrison sides. They were very successful. I mean, they were proper footballers. So of course, they're beating soldiers. And eventually, the German High Command realised this is getting slightly embarrassing, that the Untermensch are beating the Germans. And so they bring in the Luftwaffe's team, which is called Flakelf, and that contained former footballers, people who'd been footballers in the 30s. They played against them. Start won 5-1. They arranged a rematch 3 days later, and this is the game that's very contentious. It appears Start won 5-3, and within about a fortnight of that, their players began to be rounded up by the Gestapo, and they suffer a range of different fates before them end up being murdered.
So all of them were murdered, or only some?
No, so what happened? So the problem we got with this is that when the war ended, after the Soviets had retaken Kiev, a lot of the people involved were very reluctant to talk about the game because they were worried they'd be seen as having collaborated with the Germans. Um, and so you have at least 10 years, maybe 15 years of silence. Nobody's talking about what happened.
Yeah.
After Stalin's death, the mood becomes much more liberal, and the Soviets realized the propaganda potential of this story, that here's this great Soviet team who managed to, despite all the difficulties of life in Kiev, the lack of food, the lack of resources, the lack of facilities, that they're able to beat this team representing the Luftwaffe. And so you then get a massively inflated version of what happened. So some stories say that players are being shot at on the pitch, which is obviously not true. So trying to piece together exactly what happened is difficult. But it seems that roughly a fortnight after the game, the Germans had a list of players who had been registered with Dynamo Kiev at the start of the war. Now, Dynamo were the secret police team, the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB. So it's understandable the Germans want to round them up anyway. So it maybe had nothing to do with the game. It might just be coincidence. So they round up 8 or 9 of them. There's one of them, for reasons that's not clear, he's rather than being taken to the camp at Sirets, which is where the others were taken, he was sent to work in fields outside Kiev. I don't think he had a farming background, but for some reason they thought he was better deployed doing that. One of them was a shoemaker, and he took one of his mates from the team, said, "Oh no, he's a shoemaker as well." And the Germans needed people to mend their boots and to make new boots, so they weren't in the camp. They were working in Podol, the old centre of Kiev, and it's one of them, Maka Honcharенko, whose testimony is sort of the most solid, I think, witness statement version of what happens.
Yeah.
So there is a player called Korakik, who had not just been a footballer, but he had actually been a serving NKVD officer. And because he wasn't actually registered to Dynamo at the start of the war, he's picked up much later, and he's tortured and he dies under torture. So he's the first one to die. And this happens in the autumn of 42, and then in February 43, on the anniversary of the foundation of the Red Army, what remains of the Ukrainian or Soviet resistance carries out a bombing attack on a factory that repaired motorized sleds, which obviously in Ukrainian winter was hugely important. And as a reprisal for that, at this camp at Sirets, 1 in 3 prisoners are executed. and three of the Dynamo players are shot. It happens that one of them is the goalkeeper, Mikola Truzovic, who was the most charismatic player, the sort of leader of the team. And then the other two, Klemenko and Kuzmarov, had scored in this game. But it does seem that's coincidence that there's three such significant figures. Honosharenko, who scored twice in the game, he was at his cobbler's shop in Podol with Sverdovsky, who'd sort of been there. He was a senior player. He was working as their coach. He's a fullback. He was the one who Honosharenko said, "Oh yeah, he knows how to make shoes as well." Right. They got told what was happening, and they're able to make a run for it, and they escape. So Podol, I mean, if you go to Kiev before the war started, Podol's sort of the artistic quarter. There's loads of sort of narrow streets, alleyways, and because they know it, they're able to get away from the Germans. So they escape. So there's four of them are killed after the game. One of them dies about a week before the game. It's not entirely clear how or why. Probably illness, but it's not clear.
And what do you think it was like for the players before the match and during?
It's really hard to tell because it's really difficult to know exactly what the context of the game was. I think the fact that a rematch was arranged almost immediately, so within 24 hours of the first game, there's posters going up advertising the rematch. That suggests that the Germans are not happy. They want to put this right straight away. So the odd thing is the first game happens on a Thursday afternoon, so there's hardly anybody there. It's not mentioned in the papers. So I sort of think if the Germans had wanted to sort of hush this up, they could have just ignored it and it would have gone away. But because they arranged this rematch, suddenly it takes on this new significance, this new life. There's stories that the referee was an SS officer. That may be true. There's stories he spoke very good Russian, which again is entirely plausible, but the players seem to have found that quite sinister. They were warned by various people. They're 3-1 up at half time, and they're warned by various people. You lose the game in the second half. It's really bad news. Don't keep winning that. And the thing is, the first half is really well documented. I think we've been very confident it was 3-1 at half time. The second half, the stories go mad. So it's very, very difficult to know exactly what happened. So whether they were intimidated, whether they just thought it was another game, it's really, really hard to say with any certainty.
Okay. So what you're saying essentially is that the post-Stalin's death, the USSR used sort of the games as like propaganda. Like, okay, yeah. And
exactly that, yeah.
How did like the games like originally start? Like what initially caused the Germans to organize the matches?
So this is from March 42. They realize that they need some sense of normality to return to life. Because what their ideal is for ordinary Ukrainians, ordinary Kievans to just accept Germany and okay, we're part of Germany now. We used to be part of the Soviet Union, now we're part of Germany. They want things to return as far as possible to the normal. And there are divides. So I think there's two distinct factions within the German high command. One thinks they should try and crush them. One thinks we should just try and govern them and get them on our side. There definitely were Ukrainians. You got to remember that there'd been the famine in the 30s, which had been, Stalin's fault. Stalin had almost deliberately orchestrated it. So there were certainly Ukrainians who thought that Germany would be a better ruler than the Soviets. I mean, one of the tragedies of this story is a Jewish player called Lazar Kogan, who he'd run a hardware shop, and he'd been taken off him by the Soviets when they collectivized, all business and all industries. And he thought the Germans would give him his shop back. He didn't realize being Jewish was going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. And he actually told three of the other players, "No, don't leave. It's fine. The Germans are on our side. It's better than the Soviets." And of course, what happens is that the Jews are rounded up, and 33,000 of them are murdered in a weekend, and he was one of them. And Yakmenechov, who was the sort of the reserve keeper, and Chernobyl, two other players who he told, "No, don't go. It'll be fine." They also are both killed. So yeah, the football was sort of 6 months after the invasion. It's things are getting back to normal. Football can go ahead at weekends. Go and watch football, have a nice time. It's not all about sort of making life miserable.
And what do you think the football like meant to the players and the people watching? Do you think it was just fun or like maybe a bit more than that?
Yeah, I mean that's another one of those questions. It's really hard to know. So I think at the very least, it was a distraction. It was something that wasn't miserable. It was a reminder of what life had been before the war. And in that sense, I think valuable in terms of just helping people get on with life. And, in a bit in this, obviously a much lesser way, but in the same way that in lockdown, we started watching German football because it came back first. So it's just any football is a way of sort of giving us something to talk about, giving us something to watch. It's not just the misery of everyday life. And I think once you start seeing Ukrainians regularly beating these garrison sides, initially Hungarian and Romanian garrison sides, and then the German sides, if you're a defeated people seeing you know your countrymen, your fellow citizens of Kiev beating the occupying power, I think that has to give you a sense of yes, we are resilient. We're not totally broken. It does become a sort of a rallying point for the resistance and dissent. Quite how overtly they're able to express that, I suspect not very, but I think it couldn't help but do that.